Alright, welcome back to the Recipe Analyst. Today I'm going to be making Everything Bagel Crackers from Texture Over Taste by Joshua Weissman. I decided to make this just because it sounded kind of interesting. Everything bagel, but in a cracker instead of a bagel. So to start, I'll go ahead and make the dough by combining the all-purpose flour, the whole wheat flour, and the salt, giving that a whisk until it's combined. And then I get some warm water from the sink. I need about a third cup of that. And I add in 3.5 tablespoons of olive oil. And I whisk in the warm water into that mixture. And this recipe is a little interesting. This is all the liquid that you're supposed to add to it. And as you can see, it's very dry. And the next step is to knead it after you mix it. And you'll see that there's no way that this was going to come into a smooth dough as the recipe calls for with such little moisture in the dough. So initially I'm just trying to give it a shot. Maybe it'll come together if you knead it long enough. The recipe says 2 to 3 minutes, but after about 5 minutes I realized there's no way this is going to become a smooth dough. So I get a little extra water from the sink and I start adding a tablespoon at a time and kneading that in until I obtain a smooth dough. I think I added about 6 tablespoons of water to reach a smooth dough that held itself together. So the recipe definitely didn't give you any steps or guidance on what the dough should look like, how much water you might need to add. It just says add a third cup of water and 3.5 tablespoons of olive oil, mix it, and then knead it until it's smooth. And if you just go based on that, you'll never get a smooth dough and you'll have a really bad time with this recipe. So I think this is the last tablespoon of water that I added. It took me about 10 to 15 minutes of kneading to get to this point, and of course adding all that extra water. And at that point you see it's holding itself together pretty well, and it's fairly smooth. So I wrap it up and set that aside, and then I start on the Everything Bagel seasoning, and I use that mixture of sesame seeds. I add the garlic, the onion flakes, the poppy seeds, and some flaky sea salt, and I just mix that up and I set that aside for later on. And I prepare 2 baking sheets by lining them with parchment paper. Next, I'm going to split the dough in half, and then I'm going to split those halves into 4 even pieces. I didn't show it here, but I made sure each was about 2 ounces. And then I use a rolling pin to roll it out. The recipe says you could use a pasta machine or a pasta roller to make it a lot easier, and you can probably get a lot thinner and more even crackers, but I don't have one of those, so I did my best with the rolling pin. I go ahead and roll out all the crackers from this half of the dough, and then I go ahead and separate the egg yolk from the egg white of 1 egg and brush that on top of each cracker. And then I sprinkle about a teaspoon of the Everything Bagel seasoning on top of each cracker. And I go ahead and put those in the oven for about 15 minutes. And in the meantime, I went ahead and prepared the other crackers, so I put those in the oven right after this. I put them on a cooling rack and I let them cool completely before giving them a taste. So what did I think of these crackers? So these were in the crunchy section of Texture Over Taste, but only the very outside edges were actually somewhat crunchy or crispy, and most of the cracker is actually pretty soft. It could be because I didn't roll out the dough as thin as I needed to, but the recipe doesn't give any guidelines for how thin the dough should be before you bake them. The amount of water that I needed to add, it couldn't have been the 1/3 cup, because as you could see earlier, that was probably never going to result in a dough that came together. So I think the recipe should have gave me some guidance on how to deal with that. As far as the flavor goes, the cracker itself doesn't have all that much flavor, and it's mostly just the Everything Bagel seasoning, which is somewhat reasonable. But if you wanted a little bit more to your cracker than just Everything Bagel seasoning, you might be a little bit disappointed. So I'm gonna have to give this recipe a 6 out of 10. The recipe itself just doesn't give enough details to create a successful result, and the end result that I got was really nothing special. Anyway, if you want to read a more in-depth analysis, you can always go to therecipeanalyst.com to read the blog, and thanks for watching.